Ang kasalanan ko lang yung mga extrajudicial killing.
The crime and drug-infested shanties of the Philippine archipelago have been turned into a drug war zone in the 5 bloody years of Rodrigo Duterte's presidency.
It's not a dog, my son. It's not a dog or a pig to kill like them.
We are appalled by the apparently arbitrary killing of 9 activists, simultaneous police-military operations surrounding the Metro Manila area in the Philippines in the early hours of Sunday morning.
Why wouldn't you want all of that money back in the hands of the Filipino people?
The narrative.
May I just ask you why that's funny? Why that's funny?
The government-sponsored press conference to present 2 Philippine environment activists who had earlier gone missing. They accused the military and police of abducting them and forcing them to make false statements.
Ang totoo po dinukot kami ng mga militar.
Pinipilit kong maging matatag para sa aking anak. Dahil yun lamang ang aking maiyahandog. Hindi ako iiyak dahil alam ko may kaunti pang pag-asa na natitira para siya ay ating makita.
Mistulang mga bulalakaw na nagliwanag at umalingaw ang bumulabog sa mga residente ng Pilar Abra at Santa Maria, Ilocos Sur.
CCTV footage has been released showing the shooting of peace consultant Randy Malayao and the gunman who killed him.
The International People's Tribunal 2024 aims to investigate and address the war crimes committed by the U.S.-supported Marcos Jr. and Duterte regimes. It serves as a platform for victims and advocates and their organizations to present evidence and legal arguments related to the crimes committed against the Filipino people. The IPT 2024 gives particular attention to the role and complicity of the U.S. government in the war crimes and other violations of international humanitarian law committed by the Duterte and Marcos Jr. regimes. The Tribunal will examine cases of IHL violations in the context of the U.S.-supported Marcos Jr. and Duterte regime's so-called counterinsurgency operations. The Tribunal's legal proceedings is led by a panel of international jurors, assisted by a team of prosecutors and legal experts. The IPT will hear from resource persons and witnesses to gather evidence that will be used for the proceedings. The International People's Tribunal on the War Crimes of the U.S., Marcos Jr. and U.S. Duterte regimes represent a crucial opportunity to address historical injustices and exact accountability for their crimes against humanity. By examining the role of the United States in supporting the Duterte and Marcos Jr. regimes and holding them accountable to their violations of international humanitarian law, the IPT aims to contribute to the ongoing pursuit of truth, justice, and accountability.
Magandang umaga. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us here in Brussels for the International People's Tribunal 2024 titled Katarungan, the Filipino People versus the U.S. Government and the Marcos and Duterte regimes. The IPT 2024 is co-convened by the International Association of Democratic Lawyers and the Friends of the Filipino People in Struggle. In order to address and investigate the war crimes of the U.S.-supported Marcos and Duterte regimes. The Friends of the Filipino People in Struggle was founded in 2021 as a global solidarity organization united in supporting the Filipino people for their struggle in genuine democracy, freedom, and social liberation. Let us welcome Robert Reid, who is the chairperson of FFPS, to say a few words. Robert.
Bonjour, mabuhay, kia ora katoa. But prior to the jurors coming in, we just wanted to welcome, on behalf of Friends of the Filipino People in Struggle, and our associate conveners, the International Association of Democratic Lawyers, to welcome you to this very, very significant event today. It is so important that we are all here today and tomorrow, and for the people on the live stream, so we can provide a place and a venue in which Filipino people can exercise their mandate to try the US government and the Duterte and Marcos Jr. Philippine administrations for their crimes against them. Over the past few years, we have seen an intensification of attacks on the Filipino people by the US-backed and US-directed Duterte and Marcos regimes. There have been many brutal and well-documented cases that demonstrate gross violations of human rights and international humanitarian law, from extrajudicial killings to massacres of civilians, from repressive red tagging to aerial bombardments of communities. The Duterte and Marcos regimes have viciously terrorized Filipino people. Despite the extensive and tireless efforts of Philippine human rights activists and organizations such as Chairperson in documenting these various violations and supporting the victims, no justice has yet been served. However, over the next 2 days, we will hear firsthand from witnesses and legal experts about the extent, the nature, and manifestations of the war crimes committed by the US-backed regime. As such, this International People's Tribunal serves as an important opportunity to provide a platform for the Filipino people and their struggle for justice and genuine social change. Many of the violations of international humanitarian law have taken place in the Philippine countryside, in the rural and remote areas of the country. And it is also in these parts of the country that the struggle of the Filipino people to free themselves from the shackles of imperialism, feudalism, and bureaucrat capitalism wages the strongest. After centuries of colonial and semi-colonial occupation and oppression, the Filipino people are strongly asserting their right for national and social liberation. They've taken destiny into their own hands. They have established the broadest united front of workers and peasants and other progressive forces through the National Democratic Front of the Philippines. The National Democratic Front of the Philippines represents the exploited and oppressed Philippine people and has demonstrated to the international community not only the necessity and justice of the people's war that has been undertaken in the Philippines, but that armed struggle is a legitimate exertion of Filipinos' inherent rights to self-determination. As Filipino people are struggling to be free, they are faced by brutal and violent repression. The common thread between the cases of massacres, aerial bombings, red tagging, is that both the Marcos and Duterte claim that such attacks attacking civilians, entire communities, and indigenous leaders are so-called counterinsurgency operations against communist forces. However, international humanitarian law prohibits collective punishment during an armed conflict, and that is tantamount to a war crime, and we will hear some of that over the next couple of days. This War Crimes Tribunal will also take place over the next 2 days is not only an important venue for the Filipino people, but also of special importance to us as international solidarity friends and those who support peace and justice in the world. The reality of today is that US imperialism funds wars and directs wars across the whole globe. In the 1990s, the US perfected their so-called strategy of low-intensity conflict in the Philippines. More later, in 2009, the Obama administration talked about their counterinsurgency guide, or COIN. The guide was introduced as a concept of a whole-of-nation approach which combines military, political, economic, and social measures to counter what the US government deems as terrorists. In the case of the Philippines, these are simply Filipino people fighting for their rights and their aspirations. And because they represent the biggest obstacles to the US government's strategic interests in the region and its imperialist aggression and warmongering in Asia Pacific, and more, they're preparing for war against China. Because of this backing from the US, war criminals, not just in Israel, as we see on television every day, but in Philippines, think that they can get away with murder. Marcos Jr. and Duterte have both massacred civilians, recklessly bombed entire communities with impunity in the name of their counterinsurgency operations designed and financed by the US government. The right for oppressed and exploited people to fight for self-determination urgently needs to be protected against the onslaught of US imperialism. For this reason, we need to strengthen our ties and not hesitate to challenge the US and other imperialists in all places. In turn, this War Crimes Tribunal can also serve as a basis for future actions and to serve and support other national liberation struggles in pursuit of their justice. Let us ensure that the US government, Marcos and Duterte administrations cannot act with impunity, that they are always reminded that the world is watching and that peace-loving forces of the world stand with the Filipino people and their demand for justice. I can remember back to the 1980s when early 1980s, when the Permanent People's Tribunal held a hearing on the Philippines, which opened the world's eyes, including my own, to the reality of what was happening in that country. The impact of that hearing was pivotal in shining the light on the US Marcos dictatorship of the time. Today, the Filipino people will again have their day in court. Thank you very much, and it's good to see so many of you here.
Hello, everyone. This is Jeanne Mirrer, President of the International Association of Democratic Lawyers. I want to give you warm greetings from the IADL, all of our associations around the world, and all of the people that are working on this tribunal from many of our associations. We are so proud to be co-convening this important International People's Tribunal, and have done so in the past, and almost all of the ones that have been held on the Philippines, especially since the Filipino people and the lawyers and the human rights defenders and the people's movements have been under such attack and suffering so much from their repressive regimes. IADL is co-convening this in part because we have a history of working to expose the history of violations of international law that is not going to be covered by the victors and by the powerful, but by the only way to make a record is through the people's record. And one of the things that's been very impressive about all of the tribunals that have been convened by the Filipino associations and our friends have been the incredible amount of preparation, professionalism, development of the records and facts, and it is going to be a very important meeting that you will be having, hearing witnesses, hearing testimonies, hearing expert testimonies, hearing from the prosecutors. I want to mention that right now, international humanitarian law, which is the focus of this tribunal, is in crisis. It's in crisis in Gaza, it's in crisis in Ukraine, it's in crisis throughout the world, where people feel where leaders feel that they can just ignore civilian populations and claim everybody who they don't like is fair game in people's struggles, which they are not. Again, I would like to thank everybody who is participating, all of the prosecutors again, the juries, the jurors, the expert witnesses, the witnesses who are coming forward to give their testimonies. I wish this tribunal every success. I look forward to reading the proceedings and seeing the verdict, and IADL will be with you all of the way. Anytime you need us, we are there for you. Thank you very much.
Mga kasama, mes amis, dear friends, the International Coalition for Human Rights in the Philippines is honored to be an endorser of this International People's Tribunal 2024 to investigate alleged violations of international humanitarian law, otherwise known as war crimes, committed by the US-supported Marcos Jr. and Duterte regimes against the Filipino people. I come from the lands of Indigenous people in Australia. The Global Council of ICHRP salutes the International Association of Democratic Lawyers and the Friends of the Filipino People in Struggle for convening this tribunal. The witnesses we will hear from will be displaying the courage and determination of the Filipino people to assert their basic human rights to life, freedom, self-determination, and genuine development. We will see their advocates working to establish the truth to the standard of a court of law, and this is also an act of courage, given the terrible state repression of political critics in the Philippines. We salute the panel of jurors and their commitment to weigh up the evidence and to reach an appropriate verdict. We continue to be inspired by the work of Chairperson and all of the partner organizations we have as ICHRP in the Philippines. They conduct the dangerous documentation work that ensures that we all have the solid data to work with. ICHRP co-convened the IPTs, which took place in Washington, D.C. in 2015, and here in this same room in Brussels in 2018, which continued to build on the findings of the Permanent People's Tribunal 2 sessions on the Philippines in 1980 and 2007, and the IPT, which took place in Quezon City in 2005. These great efforts and the work of the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights in 2020 and of the prosecutor at the International Criminal Court demonstrated beyond doubt that the regimes of Marcos Sr., Arroyo, Aquino III, and Duterte were rogues on the international stage. And now we will examine the Marcos Jr. regime with a sharp focus on violations of international humanitarian law against the peasants, the indigenous peoples, and the workers of the Philippines. This year, the International Court of Justice found there is plausible genocide by Israeli forces against the Palestinian people in Gaza. And that finding has been ignored by the US government, the principal supplier of weapons to Israel. ICHRP expresses its wholehearted solidarity with the Palestinian people in their struggle for survival and self-determination. As we begin these 2 days, ICHRP challenges the international community of states to face the facts already established about the Philippines and withdraw all policies of cooperation with the Philippine government. We condemn the US, Australian, Japanese, Canadian, Israeli, and South Korean governments, which continue to arm the regime and provide it with political cover. We call on the prosecutor of the ICC to rapidly finalise its investigation of the Duterte regime's crimes against humanity and issue warrants of arrest. We call on the international community to rapidly, promptly respond to the verdict of this International People's Tribunal. Karapatang ng mamamayan, ipaglaban. Maraming salamat po.
All rise. The International People's Tribunal on the Philippines is now in session. Silence is hereby enjoined. Julen Arzuaga is a Basque politician, writer, and lawyer, and member of the Euskal Area Bildu Coalition in the Basque Parliament. He is the founder and member of the Basque Observatory of Human Rights and has represented human rights victims in various bodies and mechanisms of the United Nations. He is part of the European Association of Democratic Lawyers and a member of the Basque Parliament. Séverine Delevle is a Belgian politician, active for Ecolo. Delevle graduated from the Université Libre de Bruges. She became coordinator and secretary general of the Brussels non-governmental organization, Quinoa, and worked at the Red Cross Belgium as a project manager in Congo, Kinshasa. She was elected as a municipal councillor of Worst for Ecolo. She was also elected as a member of the Chamber of Representatives from 10th place on the Brussels Ecolo list. Suzanne Adderley is a founder of the Middle East, North Africa Labor Solidarity Network in the United States. Suzanne has been active in anti-war and Palestine solidarity organizing in the US since her youth. Suzanne is the daughter of Jordanian workers and grew up in Yonkers, New York. She previously worked as a high school teacher in New York and Cairo. She is a longtime member of Al-Auda, New York, the current president of the National Lawyers Guild, and the Defend the Egyptian Revolution Committee of New York. Reverend Dr. Joris Verkamen is a parish priest and professor of practical theology at the Old Catholic Seminary of the University of Utrecht. He served as rector of the Old Catholic Seminary, was elected the 83rd Archbishop of Utrecht of the Old Catholic Church of the Netherlands. He retired as Archbishop and was also elected as member of the Central Committee of the World Council of Churches in 2013 until 2021. Lennox Hines is founder of the National Conference of Black Lawyers and former counsel for the African National Congress. In addition to his practice as a criminal defense and international human rights lawyer, he was Nelson Mandela's U.S. attorney and served as counsel again for the African National Congress. He is the permanent representative to the United Nations for the IADL, was appointed by the UN as lead counsel to represent the interests of defendants accused by the International Criminal Tribunal of Rwanda of genocide, crimes against humanity, and other serious violations of international humanitarian law. He is a retired professor of law in the criminal justice program at Rutgers University.
This People's International Tribunal is now in session, and I'm calling the tribunal to order. Let me briefly outline the procedures under which this tribunal will be conducted. These procedures would be posted on the tribunal's website. But let me just briefly outline for you these procedures. I'm not going to go into full detail, but just outline.
My colleagues here sitting
on the bench are called jurors. Those of you who are familiar with the common law system of the law. That is a system that has been adopted by former British colonies. We have what is called a common law system. You have jurors, a panel of jurors, and you have a judge. The jurors are the finders of fact, and the judge sitting and presiding, separate from the panel of jurors, makes conclusions of law. There's another system called a civil law system. And in that system, instead of having a bifurcated panel of jurors and a judge, it is combined. We here are having this system of the civil law. That is, my colleagues, or the jurors will be making determinations combining both findings of fact and conclusions of law. But we are called jurors, but we provide and will be providing this bifurcated function. The tribunal will hear and examine and evaluate testimonies of witnesses, experts, resource persons, as well as data, information, facts, analysis, evidence that is presented to it orally or in writing, in person, or through other efficient modes of communication. There are another body of who will be involved in the proceeding. They are called complainants. That is, individuals or entities who have been harmed by the actions of the defendants. The complainants are composed of the Filipino people, as represented by victims, relatives, and witnesses, representing basic sectors of the Philippine society that appeal to the conveners to convene this tribunal. And then there are defendants. Defendants are individuals or entities who are being charged by the complainants of alleged crimes committed against whom? Committed against the Filipino people. We then have a prosecution, a panel of people's prosecutors made up of international human rights lawyers who shall represent the complainants and their witnesses and help prepare the indictment and present witnesses and other evidence orally or in writing, in person, or through some other efficient mode of communication. There then is a defense. The defense would be represented by lawyers or agents of defendants who shall represent them, if in writing or orally. We also have provisions for witnesses. These are victims, relatives, and individuals with personal knowledge or familiarity or expertise on the case and issues covered by and relevant and material to the grounds of the charged indictment. We have a clerk of the court, and you will, from time to time, hear the clerk of the court provide the lawyers and individuals with administrative support for the panel of jurors or judges. The clerk also acts as an ad hoc spokesperson for the jurors and will be monitoring the various phases of the proceeding. You will hear us address an amicus curiae. Amicus is a friend of the court, is a friend of the panel of judges, and may be invited or requested to give opinions, advice, information, and expertise, assistance to the tribunal. There would be a secretariat. These are individuals requested by the conveners to provide technical, logistical, administrative assistance. There will be, and you may hear us refer to an indictment. The indictment should clearly state the grounds or charges constituting the alleged crimes of all offenses committed by the defendant. Now, let me just quickly go over how the process of the procedure would proceed. At this stage, I, as the presiding juror, is setting forth and sharing with you the procedures of this tribunal. The customary rules of procedure and evidence and generally accepted basic minimum standards of due process of an impartial tribunal and its proceedings have been adopted by this tribunal. Adjustments in the procedure shall be made so that we have flexibility and so that the proceedings do not become too burdensome. In any event, at the minimum, the standard of proof for the verdict shall
that is that there would be substantial evidence that a reasonable mind might accept as adequate to support the conclusion. Evidence from both parties may be given any weight by the panel of jurors and shall not only be credible in and of itself, but must come from a credible source. Failure on the part of the complainant or the defendant to so notify and/or with non-appearance or participation in the sessions or proceedings of the tribunal shall be deemed to have waived their right to participate or to present evidence, and the panel of jurors shall issue a verdict on the basis of the available evidence, if so sufficient, either for or against the complainant or the defendant. Let me make a final comment about the verdict. The panel of jurors, upon due deliberation and consensus, and consistent with these rules and time limitations and other practical considerations will render the verdict on the basis of the facts and evidence adduced. The verdict shall make a ruling or determination by consensus of the jurors who are here on whether or not the evidence that has been presented before the tribunal shows that one, some or all of the defendants has or have been complicit in and therefore guilty of the alleged violations by either performing, pursuing, or promoting measures violating the rights of the complainants or remaining practically or absolutely silent to stop or stun such violations and thereby perpetuating them, or systematically and habitually failing to act to alleviate such violations or the conditions of the complainants. So these are the procedures, an outline of the procedures that will govern this tribunal. Now, I'm addressing this to the prosecutors. May I have your appearances?
Thank you, Mr. President. We have a prosecution team, and I have the honor to lead that prosecution team. My name is Jeanne Mirrer. I'm a lawyer at the bar of Brussels in Belgium. We have 4 members of the prosecution team here today, and they will introduce themselves to you in a second. But I also wish to mention before that we are assisted by a team of 6 prosecutors who are in the Philippines, who prepare the materials, who are following the proceedings through a live link, and who will assist us in our work before this tribunal today. In particular, Efraim Cortés, Josalie Dengla, Juliana Palo, Maria Elena Carlos, Mel Domini Ebo, and Ma Diobelin Berayo. And now each of my colleagues will introduce him or herself to the panel of jurors.
Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Roland Meister. I'm human rights defender in Germany and lawyer since more than 40 years.
Good morning, Your Honors. I'm Catherine Panguban from the National Union of People's Lawyers from the Philippines.
Good morning, Your Honors. My name is Zarina Goda Esmusti. I am a member of the Union of People's Lawyers in Mindanao, and I respectfully appear for the Filipino people in this case, Your Honor. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I would like to ask our amicus curiae, Mr. Edre Olalia, to please stand.
Thank you, Your Honor. It's an honor and privilege to be of assistance to the tribunal. Good morning, Your Honors.
To the clerk of the court, were the defendants sued?
By the authority of this tribunal, the summons were served to all of the defendants through their representatives or agents. If they were served via certified mail, duly receipted, with a copy of the indictment enclosed. They were informed of their right to present their defense and ordered to inform this honorable tribunal whether and when and how they wish to participate in the proceedings. The defendants were also furnished copies of the calendar of the case and the rules of procedure of the tribunal.
Do we have proof of such service?
We do, Your Honors. We refer to the records, the corresponding proofs of service, of receipt.
Have the defendants notified this tribunal or notified your office concerning their intentions to appear or participate in the proceedings?
Up to this point, Your Honor, no.
All right. We will consider the non-appearance of the defendants and their failure to timely notify the clerk of this court, of this tribunal, of their intentions, whether to appear or not, that they're deemed to have waived their appearance, and we will proceed accordingly to the rules of procedure. Could we have the reading of the abstract of the indictment? The indictment is quite lengthy, and so in terms of brevity of time, would the clerk read the abstract of the indictment?
So the charges in the abstract are serious violations of the laws applicable in armed conflict that constitute war crimes involving the killing and massacre of civilians, the abduction, torture, and other forms of cruel, degrading, and inhuman treatment of civilians, directing attacks against civilians and civilian objects, the forced displacement of civilians, acts or threats of violence intended to spread terror among the civilian population, hamletting villages and communities, and impeding humanitarian aid and relief, and the use of means cause superfluous injury or unnecessary suffering, or cause widespread, long-term, and severe damage to the natural environment. Number 2, killing of person or de combat, and members of the NDFP that do not perform combat functions, the desecration of bodies of slain combatants, outrages upon their personal dignity, the abduction, torture, and other forms of cruel, degrading, and inhuman treatment of the said persons, and attacks, killings, abduction, arrests, detention, torture, and other forms of cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment of NDFP consultants, peace advocates, activists, human rights and environmental defenders, humanitarian aid workers, journalists, and members of organizations red tagged or terrorist tagged as fronts of the Communist Party of the Philippines, CPP, the NPA, and the NDF. Allegations, criminal conduct of defendant Philippine presidents in the context of the GRP-NDFP armed conflict, willful killing of civilians, intentionally directing attacks against civilian populations and against individual civilians not taking direct part in hostilities, willful killing of persons no longer taking an active part in hostilities or those rendered hors de combat, torture and other forms of cruel, degrading, and inhuman treatment, desecration of bodies of combatants, the commission of outrages upon personal dignity and humiliating and degrading treatment, abduction, detention, and enforced disappearance, intentionally directing attacks against civilian objects, including schools, impending humanitarian aid and relief supplies intended for civilians and civilian communities, forcibly displacing the civilian population through aerial and artillery bombardment, military operations, and attacks against civilians. And the conduct attributed to the defendants are serious violations of international humanitarian law, applicable law, includes 1949 Geneva Conventions and the 1977 additional protocols, 1966 International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, ICCPR and its optional protocols, 2005 UN Basic Principles and Guidelines on the Right to a Remedy and Reparation for Victims of Gross Violations of International Humanitarian Rights Law and serious violations of international humanitarian law, and pertinent UN General Assembly resolutions affirming the legitimacy of national liberation movements, the right of the peoples to self-determination, and the right to resort to armed struggle in the exercise thereof. The Filipino People complainants versus President Ferdinand Romualdez Marcos Jr., former President Rodrigo Roa Duterte, the government of the Republic of the Philippines, President Joseph R. Biden, and the government of the United States of America, defendants for violations of international humanitarian law or war crimes.
Thank you very much, Madam Clerk. As I noted, the rules of procedure will be posted on the website. The indictment, that was the abstract of which the clerk just read into the record, would also be on the website. What she read was an abbreviation. The indictment consists of some 12 pages of 53 paragraphs and is very lengthy and comprehensive. Those of you who would like to review the indictment would be able to do so on the website. Now, to the prosecution team, is the prosecution going to make an opening statement?
Yes, Your Honor. We are.
All right, please proceed. You can take the podium.
Thank you. Distinguished members of the tribunal, ladies and gentlemen, the International People's Tribunal is convened to hear a case brought by the Filipino people at the instance of the individual victims of rights violations and their families, particularly the peasants, workers, urban and rural poor, fisherfolk, women, youth and students, indigenous peoples and national minorities, migrants, religious, journalists, legal professionals, and human rights defenders. As said by the clerk already, the accused are current President Ferdinand Romualdez Marcos Jr., his predecessor, former President Rodrigo Roa Duterte, the government of the Republic of the Philippines, current President of the United States of America, Joseph R. Biden, and the government of the United States of America. The prosecution will establish beyond doubt that all these defendants are guilty of gross and systematic violations of international humanitarian law or war crimes, as have been already detailed when the clerk read out to you the abstract of the indictment a few seconds ago. All these violations arose from the protracted armed conflict between the government of the Republic of the Philippines, supported by the United States government, on one hand, and revolutionary forces embodied by the National Democratic Front of the Philippines, on the other hand. Through its armed components, the New People's Army, the National Democratic Front of the Philippines pursues a struggle for national liberation, asserting the Filipino people's inherent right to self-determination. In response, the government of the Republic of the Philippines, and backed staunchly by the US, employs violent suppression tactics, including so-called counterterrorism efforts, and these actions have curtailed civil liberties, stifled democratic expression, and violated human rights and international humanitarian law. The extent of these transgressions is well documented. In 1980, a tribunal convened in Antwerp found dictator Ferdinand Marcos guilty of egregious offenses, including economic plunder and failure to safeguard the sovereignty of his nation against neo-colonial interventions. In March 2007, a second session of the Permanent People's Tribunal in the Philippines, held in The Hague in Holland, found Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo, along with the government of the Republic of the Philippines, George Walker Bush, the US government, and a consortium including the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization, as well as various transnational corporations and banks, guilty of gross and systematic violations of political, economic, social, and cultural rights, alongside of encroachments on the right to self-determination and liberation. The International People's Tribunal, held in Washington in 2015 and in Brussels in this very room in 2018, highlighted atrocities ranging from extrajudicial killings to economic exploitation and environmental devastation. The findings of the Brussels I Tribunal underscored the systematic nature of state-sanctioned atrocities. Despite these condemnations, subsequent reports from international non-governmental organizations, human rights groups, fact-finding missions, and UN human rights bodies affirmed the persistence of oppressive policies by the government of the Republic of the Philippines and its American ally. As resistance against these injustices mounts among Filipinos and the conflict between the government of the Republic of the Philippines and the National Democratic Front of the Philippines deepens, the GRP has escalated its repressive measures, perpetuating a cycle of violence and repression. Of particular concern are the intensified counterinsurgency and counterterrorism campaigns, marked by increasingly brutal tactics that constitute clear violations of international law. This was heralded by President Duterte's termination of the peace negotiations and the blacklisting of organizations and cadres of the revolutionary movement as terrorists under Presidential Proclamation number 174, followed by the institution of the so-called whole-of-a-nation approach to ending the local communist armed conflict under his Executive Order number 70. The Duterte administration completely blurred the lines between armed conflict and terrorism, while obscuring legitimate protests, dissent, and resistance as terrorist activities. With the passage of the Anti-Terrorism Act amid the COVID pandemic, it moved to designate the revolutionary movement as terrorists and freeze the assets of civil society organizations and individuals that had been maliciously linked with it, effectively crippling advocacy work and humanitarian efforts in conflict zones. The government also weaponized criminal law by charging revolutionaries with common crimes instead of political offenses. Activists and rights defenders faced fabricated criminal charges based on false testimonies. Peace consultants, unarmed and defenseless, were brutally murdered, some even while asleep. Instances of NPA combatants surrendering or being rendered hors de combat were met with ruthless treatment and given no quarters. State-sanctioned atrocities escalated against civilians in militarized communities that are resisting development, aggression, and corporate plunder. Tribal schools established by Lumat communities were falsely labeled as NPA training grounds and forcibly closed. Police and military forces wantonly committed massacres of civilians under the guise of executing search warrants or combating terrorism. Despite President Marcos Jr.'s assertions of a departure from the sinister Duterte's human rights record, the reality remains starkly similar. Impunity is still prevailing as prosecutions for extrajudicial killings numbering around 20,000 amount to mere token gestures in the face of systemic injustice. In exchange for aiding the rehabilitation of the Marcos family name, the United States has ensured that the Philippines maintains its position as a neo-colonial client state, aligning with the US imperialist objectives for the Indo-Pacific region, the Biden administration's so-called epicenter of 21st century geopolitics. The Marcos Jr. regime is serving as a willing pawn in the high-stakes geopolitical rivalry between the US and China and maintaining US dominancy in the region. The Filipino people could find themselves ensnared in a conflict not of their own choosing. In true imperialist fashion, war remains to be a profitable avenue for the US to resolve its economic crisis. The atrocities inflicted upon the Filipino people and the crimes perpetrated against them will be laid bare by the evidence to be presented before this tribunal. I harbor no uncertainty that we shall sway the esteemed panels of jurors to pronounce all defendants guilty on every count, whether by direct participation or as willing conspirators in advancing the US imperialist agenda on the domestic fascist regime. The verdict of this tribunal will empower the Filipino people and their allies across the globe to demand accountability from those responsible for those heinous crimes. Ultimately, the claimant's aspiration is to create a society where such atrocities cease to exist and where the Filipino people can fully enjoy their rights without hindrance. The journey toward liberation, justice, and accountability at present cannot rely on international mechanisms like the International Criminal Court or the UN Human Rights Council, which currently lack the readiness and efficiency to swiftly address the impassioned cry for justice reverberating across the Philippine Islands. Therefore, members of this tribunals, it is imperative to convene the International People's Tribunal on the Philippines today in pursuit of truth and accountability. This ends the prosecution's opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lead Prosecutor. While you make your way to the prosecution's table, the question that we have to you is, are you prepared and ready to present your witnesses?
Yes, Your
Honor. Could you share with us how many witnesses you have for today?
We have 11 witnesses to testify on 11 representative or emblematic cases and 4 experts or resource persons, Your Honor, and the names have been priorly submitted to the tribunal. Of these 15 individuals, 8 will testify today and 7 will testify tomorrow before this tribunal. 8 of them will testify in person, while 7 will be through recorded depositions, and each of the witnesses will be introduced by one member of the prosecution, and jurors will be informed whether this will be a live testimony or a video testimony.
Okay. Give us a minute to consult on this matter. They have 15 witnesses. Should we have a collective swearing? Sure. Could we repeat that? Of course. It's collective swearing. I've consulted with my colleagues, and given the number of witnesses, to save on time, we propose that there be a collective swearing in. Could the clerk proceed accordingly?
Will all the witnesses, experts, and resource persons present before the tribunal please rise all together and raise your hand? Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth in these proceedings? Thank you.
All right, counsel, we now have sworn in all of the witnesses. There is a technical matter, however. I note that your first witness is going to testify by video. Is that correct?
Yes.
How do we proceed? How do you recommend that we proceed? Will she be sworn in? How will you deal with that? I don't mean to just throw a monkey wrench into this.
She had already sworn in.
Oh, she is already sworn in. All right. Very good. We will proceed.
Okay, Your Honor, our